Hi everyone, it's Radiant back with another video. In this video I'm covering Innistrad, Remastered, Limited, and everything you need to know to succeed in your draft and sealed events in paper and arena. I'll break down this guide into 3 sections. The preparations you take before the event is the first step. Now starting off your preparations, we have the highlight of Paper Magic, the expensive pools to look out for. It's more crucial you don't pass these in drafts, but also lets you brag to your friends about your seal pool. Leading the value is Edgar Markov himself at $50. Second, we have Emrakul, the Promised End, at $43. However, in foil, this is worth more than Edgar, since Edgar mainly came foil in the Commander deck. We also have the Meat Hook Massacre at $35, Gisela, the Broken Blade at $35, and lastly, Hermit Druid at $30. There are a lot of expensive cards in this set, however these are the money hits to look out for. This set is very aggressive because of the power level of cards being higher. Since this is a remastered set and because of the inclusions of the werewolf transform, if you mess up your curve you can lose games very quickly. For beginners, try to draft more consistent decks with cheaper cards so you'll always have a chance. Advanced players will be able to adjust their curves to the needs of the deck with experience, but go into your event knowing this format is fast and your curve should be our priority if you don't want those werewolves to transform. How easy is it to splash? Should you go into this draft or sealed looking at splashing your bombs or fully committing to 3 colors? Is it a set where sticking to 2 colors pays off, since the only cards not in green that help you with splashing are Evolving Wilds, Traveler's Amulet, and Wildfield Scarecrow alongside the rare dual lands? I would argue that you should avoid playing more than 2 colors, especially in draft where the decks will be more streamlined. If you open fixing and an off-color bomb with a single pip, splashing for that or removal, if your deck doesn't have enough, might be fine. However, you should prioritize consistency in your deck, as there aren't many great ways to splash and the format isn't slow enough where the payoff is going to be worth it. What keywords and abilities does this set mainly use? First up, we have Disturb. Once a card with Disturb is in your graveyard, you can cast the back face by paying its Disturb cost rather than its mana cost, which it won't have while its Disturb face. Its Disturbed side is face up. The back faces of cards with Disturb have an ability that exiles them if they would be put into a graveyard from anywhere. Next up, we have Escalate. Escalate is an ability found on some mode cards that allows you to pay an additional cost to choose additional modes. You can always choose one mode for no additional cost. If a card of Escalate has 3 modes, you may pay the Escalate cost once to choose 2 modes or twice to choose all 3 modes. No matter how many times you pay the Escalate costs, the mana value of the spell is unchanged. You can always cast a card with Emerge for its mana cost as normal. However, you can cast it for its Emerge cost instead. To do this, you also sacrifice a creature, but you get to subtract that creature's mana value from the Emerge cost. The cost reduction won't affect the mana of a color. If you discard a card with Madness, you exile it instead of putting it into your graveyard. This causes a triggered ability to trigger. When that ability resolves, you may cast Exile card for its Madness cost. If you don't, it goes back into your graveyard. Flashback allows you to cast a card from your graveyard. You don't need to have cast it originally. If you cast it this way, you pay its flashback cost rather than its mana cost. Once you cast a spell using flashback, that spell will be exiled once it leaves the stack. Transform. After a double-face card transforms, it's still the same permanent, so any auras, equipment, and counters will stay on it. Any effect that was affecting it continues to do so. While a transformed double-face permanent is on the battlefield, its mana value is decided by the mana cost on its front face. This is the only exception to the general rule that each face has its own characteristics. Second, the back face has a color indicator, a dot on its type line, that tells you the card's color or colors. Next up, we will get into the draft portion of this guide, starting off with the best to worst colors. However, no color is truly bad and you should try to look at all of the colors openly. The best to worst colors are blue, white, black, green, and red. Now into the decks. For the first tier of archetype decks, we have werewolves. This is a bit of a pet favorite, but first off, you may have noticed that I put green and red as the worst colors, and this doesn't impact the deck. If werewolves are open, you'll find all the best cards, including a great removal spell, as late as you want in draft, as if they're not playing werewolves, they're not going to want to take it. If you build the deck right, you should be the most aggressive creature deck, as if your opponent messes up their curve, this deck will destroy them, as none of the cards are bad before transforming. The only problem this deck has is getting a turn with a transform board on the attack. Next up, we have zombies, arguably the most powerful. However, at least in draft, the cards for this deck won't be as available as other decks will steal them. This is more of a control deck, so it will be interesting to see if it's fast enough for this format. However, the compelling deterrence has to be one of the best cards at uncommon, so the deck can have a strong early control and good late game value from the graveyard, making this a great deck for most matchups. The final deck in this top tier is Spirits. The main advantage of the Spirit deck is being able to control the game pace, as most of your board will fly and you'll be able to play aggressive flyers or late game by utilizing Disturb in your graveyard to outvalue the opponent. The second tier, Humans. There are a lot of go wide decks in this format. Notably, they can all be good with the right cards drawn. However, the green-white Humans deck can go wide with a lot of good pump cards and creatures. Since some of the cards are more tribal, it'll be easier to draft a better deck when it's open than other go wides. Also, travel preparation is nuts, so you can win by just having the biggest early creatures with that card. The Vampires deck. More of a madness deck revolving around blood tokens to discard your cards and let you cast them while generating more value. An amazing deck, however, you need to have a good curve to get the madness cards and generate the blood for them. Overall, a solid archetype, but probably fairly slow in the early game if you don't start off with enough madness enablers. In draft, it will be harder to pick up the cards you need as other decks utilize madness too, and a lot of the madness cards are fairly playable in the first side. The Sacrifice deck is probably the borderline tier 3. However, there are some really strong cards in this Sacrifice deck, and most of the game plan is ending up with lots of 1/1 spirits with flying. However, this is just a solid deck for removal and good value creatures. In tier 3, we have the remaining decks. Keep in mind, these decks can all be strong, and a lot of the rating is meant for drafts and availability of cards. The Spells deck has some very powerful payoffs for fueling your graveyard with instants and sorceries. So this deck is looking to run a control build, using Flashback and Self-Mill for value, and winning with Rise from the Tides, or another generator. Overall, a solid deck, but there will be a lot of competition for the removal you'll need a premium of, and this deck will still underperform without interaction to give you the turns you need. Then, we have the Go Wide Red-White deck. This deck has a good pump effect and decent creatures, however there's probably better options. This deck has access to better removal than the Go Wide Humans deck, however there isn't a lot of synergistic cards and this is more of a generic aggro plan. Pretty straightforward deck. You want to trade off your early creatures so your late game creatures get good value. It's an alright strategy, but very easy for your opponent to play around once they see what you're trying to do. Lastly, blue-green, where having creatures in the yard is the goal. This deck will either be top tier or too slow to compete. If you can find enough self-mill for this deck, then I reckon it's a solid playable. However, relying on a big creature to win the game only works if you've managed to survive the early game. And with a lot of aggressive decks in this format, it's going to be a mission to set up and resolve your threats. Next up, we have an evaluation of how high we should be taking removal after looking through all the archetypes. Removal that exiles will be almost first pickable, as this is mainly a graveyard set. However, I recommend removal strongly, as aggro decks need it to push the creatures, and the slow decks need it the most to give the deck a chance to push their value. There are also more tribal decks which can focus on taking the best cards later in the pack. How valuable is card draw and advantage? With Disturb, the madness value and flashback, all of the graveyard synergy will mean you won't be needing to prioritize card draw, as you'll get most of your value in the late game from the graveyard. There aren't any obvious traps in this set, however for newer players stay away from cards that may require a very good deck for them to even function, like Lupine Prototype, and there are cards that simply shouldn't be played, as Intangible Virtue will almost always be worse than another reasonable creature. Lastly, game plan. What tricks are gonna blow us out and what board wipes are in the set? Also notable, what counterspells do we need to look out for? First up, we have combat tricks and flash creatures. These are good to become familiar with, as if your opponent's holding up mana or making a weird attack, knowing what they could have will help your gameplay massively, as you can play around it. Same with board wipes. Knowing whether or not to hold everything if you're already winning, or just go all in, depends on whether or not you think they have one. And since it's only in black or white, if they aren't in those colors, you won't be wiped. And the counter spells are just good to know what mana they need for the counter, if they're holding up the mana. Last off, since there are decks that rely on dying and building a board, you should only trade early if you think they aren't waiting for a death trigger. And if they are trying to go wide, you want to preserve your life total. And that concludes my Innistrad Remastered Draft Guide and Sealed.